Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Money Pros. I'm Oliver Tutz, Certified Financial Planner Practitioner, and I'm going to be your host for the next half hour as we talk about all the issues related to your money, how to make it, how to keep it, and hopefully how to help it grow. We've got a lot to get to on today's show, so let me give you a little idea of what we're going to be talking about. First up, do you suffer from financial anxiety? I know from time to time I suffer from financial anxiety, my own money as well as everyone else's. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because that's actually a situation that's recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, and evidence indicates that it's on the increase, so we want to talk about that. We're also going to be joined by a very special guest that haven't been with us on the Money Pros before, Danilo, Reyes, and Isabel Burnett. They are with Available Staffing Network, and I'm here to tell you that the bedrock of any financial situation is a paying job, and employment is their specialty. So we're going to be talking to them about the employment market nationwide here in Rhode Island. We're going to be talking about staffing in general, so you're not going to want to miss that conversation. We're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how much does it take to be rich? Do you ever think about that? Do you ever throw that word around? He's rich, she's rich, I'm not rich. What does that actually mean? How much money does it take to actually be rich? We have a different way to look at that. We're going to be talking about those numbers. So let's dive right in and talk about our first segment, which is financial anxiety. So I saw this article recently, and this information came as no surprise to me, but I wanted to share it with the Money Pros audience. So the American Psychiatric Association does an annual poll. So they polled a little over 1,000 adults in a nationwide survey, and they create something called the National Anxiety Score. And they rank, the score is a weighted score from 1 to 100. And with respect to financial anxiety, in 2018, the score jumped 5 points from 2017. And based on their methodology and their explanation, that indicates a significant jump in the level of financial anxiety that people suffer. So some interesting things that came out of this survey and what the American Psychiatric Association shared. Last year, 2017, 56% of people that were surveyed reported financial worries, so more than half. But this year, 2018, 2/3 of people, 66%, said that they were somewhat or extremely worried about paying their bills. So there's a noticeable uptick in this level of concern. Some other things that I think are interesting about this study that they pointed out, or this survey that they pointed out, women surveyed had more financial anxiety than men. And I find this curious. I'm not sure what the reason for that would be, but that was definitely something that the survey pointed out. And also, I think interesting, 4 in 5 Hispanic adults indicated that they had financial anxiety. So they were among the highest as they look at different ethnic categories with respect to this survey. So some important things that were pointed out. Now the survey went on to examine what some of the reasons were that people suffered from financial anxiety, why people were more concerned. So let's put those up in a slide. We'll talk about these individually. So the first one was stagnant wages. So this is an important issue. We've talked about it on the Money Pros before. Average earnings since 1979 for the average American have actually increased 30.2%, but the vast majority of that is because Americans are actually working more hours. Wages on an hourly basis, when adjusted for inflation, have actually remained stagnant, and that's causing concern. Number two, we've talked about this very recently on the show, record levels of consumer debt. Debt levels have had actually declined during the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, but recently indications are that they're right back up to those levels, or in fact higher than they were going back to 2004 when they hit their last record. And then finally, the high cost of housing. It's very difficult for many people to find affordable housing, and it's representing an increasing amount of the monthly expenditure that households have to shell out in terms of their monthly bills. It was also the largest component in the increase in the consumer price index over the last quarterly survey. So housing prices are rising. So all of these things are contributing to an increased sense of financial anxiety. So hopefully watching the Money Pros is a way to address that financial anxiety, but it's certainly something that's out there. All right, up next, we're going to be talking to folks from Available Staffing Network about one of many people's chief financial anxieties, finding a job. Stay with us, there's more to come. Welcome back to the Money Pros. I'm joined by some brand new guests to the Money Pros, so we're happy to have them. And they are Danilo Reyes and Isabel Burnett with Available Staffing Network. Danilo is the president.
That's correct.
And Isabel is the operations manager. So we're delighted to have them on the Money Pros. And we're going to be talking about, really, if you think about it, the cornerstone of any kind of financial plan. I mean, the bedrock of it, unless you're already retired or lucky enough to be financially independent, is you got to have a job.
That's right.
And we're talking about in the first segment about financial anxiety. I think, and we didn't talk about it as one of the causes of financial anxiety, but not being employed or being underemployed has got to be a major concern for a lot of people. If you don't have income coming in, it's definitely a concern. So let's talk about the employment situation in general nationwide. I mean, this is your specialty, but I thought it was interesting that there were some employment statistics that came out recently about unemployment numbers nationwide. What can you tell us about nationally, before we drill down into the Rhode Island market, about where the employment markets are?
Sure. You know, nationally the numbers are actually pretty good. The U.S. economy added 164,000 jobs since April of last year. The unemployment rate actually went down very much. It was 4.4 April 2017. It is now at 3.9, so we're below 4% for the first time in a little while.
So, I mean, that's a really, you know, most economists would say when unemployment is below 4.5%, the economy is doing well. We're essentially at full employment. Do you have any sense of if that number, and that's the number of people that are looking for jobs that don't have them, if a lot of people have left the workforce? Because there's a lot of talk about whether those numbers are really accurate. Do you have any personal hunch about that or feeling?
You know, my personal feeling is that things are doing well. The economy has obviously rebounded since 2007, 2008, and 2009, which was very tough years for the United States. And I think we need to do everything we can to fuel that growth. So, you know, my personal feeling is that employers are hiring. We definitely have seen that. This has been actually our best year since we started in 2014.
Okay.
Usually the first 2 or 3 months, the first 2 quarters are our slowest time, and we've actually doubled our revenue since we started.
So that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask next, which is we're talking about the national figures. Certainly the latest employment numbers to come out suggest that we're at or near record low unemployment, which is a great thing. Is Rhode Island mirroring that national phenomena? I mean, there was a time during the financial crisis, which is something we reference all the time on the Money Pros, because it's pretty fresh in many people's memories, where Rhode Island had the highest unemployment in the country, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So where are we at now? Things are great nationally. How's Rhode Island doing?
We're a slightly bit higher than the national numbers. We're at 4.5%, but I think when you look at the numbers last year, we've kind of flatlined, which is a really good sign that Rhode Island has maintained their stability, and that employers in Rhode Island are hiring. Small companies are doing very well. The large employers are also doing very well. We're seeing a lot of new orders come into the office. So Rhode Island is doing very well. And when you compare it, like you said, 5-6 years ago, where we were always the top, or if not the highest, unemployment rate in the country, I think 4.5 for the small ocean state is very good.
It's pretty incredible too, because if we were at the highest, I know we were duking it out with Michigan for a little while about who had the worst unemployment.
Yeah.
But to go from that point where we were 10+% unemployment down to 4.5,
it's outstanding.
A significant change in the job market.
Definitely.
Isabel, let me turn to you and ask you this question. It's a tight labor market, sounds like, nationally, but also here in Rhode Island. But as you're talking to people that are considering other positions, do you feel like, at least the folks you're talking to, they have the jobs they want? Are they employed or fully employed at the level of salary that they're looking for? I mean, it's one thing to say, I have a job. It's another thing to say, I have a job that's the job I want at the income level that I feel that I'm trained for and deserve. What are you hearing from the people you're talking to?
Absolutely, and I think that millennials have changed the labor market landscape a lot. It used to be that our parents and grandparents would, remained in their jobs for 20, 30 years and retired often from the same jobs. That's not the same anymore. It is not necessarily because of job dissatisfaction, but it's more of a different cultural setting that we're seeing. So people are always looking to grow. People are looking to add new skills, and with that comes the accessibility that they have to see what's in the marketplace. So while I wouldn't attribute it so much to dissatisfaction or not, at the income levels that they want, there's certainly room for growth, and that's what this generation looks for the most.
That's an interesting point you make. We've talked about this before on the show, that is a definite. We've talked about it in relationship to retirement plans and the idea that there was a time where our parents or grandparents worked at a place for their entire career and they had a pension and things along those lines. But now younger generations have come along, and it's much more common to switch jobs, which is essentially what you're referring to, and the portability of retirement plans and things like that. But do you have any theory as to why? We'll pick on millennials. We pick on millennials a lot on the show. We don't mean to do that, but it's an interesting phenomenon. Why they feel less inclined to stay at a job for an entire career or half a career or something? Do you have any theories on that?
I don't think I see it as a negative necessarily. It's just that the portability of information that we have nowadays is just greater than what we had generations before. So, millennials are looking to gain new skill sets, and sometimes that happens with looking at other opportunities. And what we do is also train our clients and talk to our clients about maximizing that job satisfaction for their employees, and that way the employees are there for as long as they can, and and they can grow within that company as well.
To their credit, I wonder if they're just less intimidated by change as well. Like they embrace newer opportunities maybe more so than previous generations.
100%. I mean, to add to that point, Isabel's absolutely right. When I started 20 years ago in staffing, there was no LinkedIn. There was no Facebook at that point. And I think that nowadays they're being hunted a lot more frequently.
Rapid fire networking.
So they're entertaining jobs more frequently. They're being told, look, there's 20,000 more here or 10,000 more here in salary. So they're more inclined to get out there and see what's available.
So then my next question would be, and I'll come back to you, Isabel. You have these job seekers out there. They, in all likelihood, many of them probably already have jobs, and we're already talking about the employment rate being as low as it is. So they're looking for a new opportunity. Maybe they want a new challenge, they want to move up, they want more money, they want something closer to home, whatever it is. What advice can you offer to those folks as they look for new opportunities? What do they need to do to be the best prepared for those things?
I would say, first of all, not be stuck to a job title. And, that's something that a lot of them do embrace, and understand that their skill set is transferable and that they can grow from that, and embrace new opportunities and just translate what they've gained thus far. Also take advantage of training opportunities. There is never too much learning. And if they do that, they become even more valuable to an employer, and that fuels the opportunities to grow within that company. So it's something that people have to look at and not just get stuck with, oh, this is what I am, because you're so much more than that.
The importance of particular skills obviously will vary depending on the position that they're considering, but are there any sort of broad-based skills that you would say any good candidate really needs to be able to fill in the blank? Think in those general terms about communication skills or writing skills or networking skills. Any thoughts along those lines?
I would say flexibility is one, because things are constantly changing.
Right.
And two is teamwork. I think it's very important to fit into the culture that you're looking for, and you have to be able to work within a team. A lot of opportunities nowadays are, work from home situations, but you're still plugged in to a network that you're working with, and if you're not able to look at the job landscape as a whole and look at the input that everybody has, then you're not going to be as valuable.
So we're talking about this marketplace where we have very low unemployment, means most people are working, and we talked specifically about millennials and their propensity to change jobs maybe more frequently than prior generations. What does this all mean for the other part of this equation, which are the employers, right? That now they are trying to run some type of business or nonprofit or whatever the organization is, and they need employees, and it's a market for the employees right now. So what are the challenges the employers are facing?
That's a challenge that one of the main reasons why I launched a staffing firm is to take on that challenge. So let me give you an example. It takes about $5,000 per hire, per new hire. And that cost actually increases if the person separates within the first few months.
And that cost is composed of what?
I mean, advertising, training,
okay.
Getting a supervisor to spend time with a new hire. That's very costly for the operations or the human resource department. So that's why our job is to try to make their life as easy as possible. This is what we do on a daily basis. So we're consistently advertising for our clients. We're consistently trying to train the employee and make sure that they go into the new job that they're taking, ready to take on the task.
You find that employers are stressed out about this? Like we talked about financial anxiety, but as a business owner or somebody that's responsible for this, is this a major concern, trying to find good employees?
100%. We see the stress levels rising consistently from HR managers, and that's why we're so busy right now.
So Available Staffing Network is an employment agency for those that are unfamiliar with what an agency does. Whether you're a candidate or an employer, what role does a firm like yours play in the employment process?
Well, in Rhode Island right now, I can't give you the exact number, but I believe there's more than 50 staffing firms in the state. We employ as a whole unit, as an industry, at about 8,500 workers per week. That's about 1,200 workers per day. So there's a big impact in the state because of this, because of the staffing industry, and we play a huge role. I think we play a very huge role, and staffing companies are really here to help companies find the employees that they need.
I have to tell you, we have to hold it there, but I find it a fascinating conversation. A good job is the cornerstone of a financial plan, and it's such a dynamic workplace right now. Happy to have both of you with us. I hope you consider coming back at some point.
Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
All right, up next, we're going to be talking about what it takes to be rich, depending on where you live in the country. Stay with us, there's more to come. Welcome back to the Money Pros. You ever ask yourself the question, how much would it take to be rich? How much would it take for me to actually feel rich? I know as a kid I used to think about, what's somebody who's rich? And I would think it was $1 million. And I'll tell you, I'm not sure $1 million gets the job done anymore. But I think that most people recognize part of it depends on where you live in the country. There are a lot of variables to cost of living and how much money people that are around you have and things like that. So we looked at some statistics to give you an idea of how people look at it on a more broadly based scale, so to speak. So one of the things was a Charles Schwab survey of Americans, and they polled and asked people, how much money would you need to have in order to be considered rich? And on average, the answer boiled down to $2.4 million in assets. So you add up the brokerage accounts, the houses, the cars, and everything else. If it tallies up to, on average, $2.4 million, the average American would consider that rich. I don't know if that's actually the number. $2.4 million in Manhattan is going to look a lot different than $2.4 million in Des Moines, Iowa, in all likelihood. But there's a lot of different ways to look at it. Another way to look at it is how much money do you make? So not so much what your level of assets is, but what is your income? So one of the ways you can look at it is the U.S. government, the highest tax bracket, depending on whether you're single or married, is going to be north of $500,000 per year. So the U.S. government would consider those folks rich. But it ultimately really depends on the income of those around you. There's definitely an aspect of it of how much do you make relative to how much everyone else makes around you. So Business Insider magazine and Pew Research looked at the largest populated city in all 50 states and the District of Columbia being thrown in there. And they looked at the median household income for those cities. And they divided the median, they essentially divided the household incomes into thirds. They looked at the low end, the middle, and then the highest third. And then they also looked at U.S. Census data to target what city they were actually going to consider. And they defined quote-unquote rich as anybody in that city that made more than double the median income of the city. So we're not talking about cost of living here. What we're talking about is how much does everybody else make, the median average, and then taking that number and doubling it, and what number would that be that would equate to being rich? So let's throw up a slide and we'll take a look at some various metropolitan areas. And the first one up, number 45 on the list of 51 metropolitan areas, Providence, Rhode Island, $74,000 a year would be double the median average for Providence. So if you make as a household $74,000 per year, you make twice the median average. Number 7 on the list of 51, Boston, Massachusetts. To earn twice the median income in Boston, you'd need to be making $117,000 per year. And then finally, number 1, Anchorage, Alaska. The folks in Anchorage are raking in the bucks. I don't know if it's the oil industry or what's going on up there, but to earn twice the median average for Anchorage, you need to be making $161,000. So keep in mind, this isn't about the cost of living, because it's certainly more expensive to live in Rhode Island in all likelihood than it is Anchorage, Alaska, when everything is taken into consideration. I'm speculating here. But it's really about how much does everybody else make around you, and what would it take to make a lot more than everyone else? So those are some different ways to consider what it takes to be rich. You can weigh those for what they're worth. All right, up next, we'll give you an idea how you can ask us a question here on the Money Pros. So stay tuned, there's more to come. That's it for the Money Pros today, folks. Thanks for watching. If you've got a question for any of our pros, including me, I hope you'll reach out to us. You can go to our Facebook page, look for the Money Pros on Facebook. You can post or instant message us a question. Go to foxprovidence.com and click on Ask the Pros. And finally, you can send me an email, moneypros@foxprovidence.com. We answer all our questions, even if we don't use them on the air, but I love to use them on the air. Thanks for watching. That's it for today's show. We'll see you again next Sunday right here on the Money Pros.